Hello, and thanks for tuning into Myth Brigade. My name is Jason, and this is another episode of Rules Bites. So for the past handful of episodes, we've been focusing on Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th Edition. In particular, we talked a lot about the combat system. So I thought it would be cool to take this episode and sort of roll it all up into a bit of review and some practical examples. Now to do this, we're going to use Roll20.net as a virtual tabletop. That way we can have the little miniatures and the dynamic lighting and the fake fire and lasers. Well, there aren't any lasers, but if we wanted to have lasers, we could have lasers. The point is, I thought it would be really cool to demonstrate the system in action just to solidify everything we've learned. So if that works for you, we're going to go over there to the computer and make this happen. And we are in the computer. All right, here we go. So on your screen is some stuff. I want to talk about that real quick. Right over here, unless you've been in some extra dimensional pocket, you'll recognize Roll20.net. A lot of groups prefer to use Fantasy Grounds, and I absolutely dig it. But Roll20 is easy. We've been using it for years. It's entirely browser-based, which has its advantages. I could say a lot more, but since we're not officially sponsored by Roll20, I'll stop here. It's good. We're using it. Let's move on. Over my head is the official Myth Brigade unofficial Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th Edition Combat Tracker. This is a simple PDF with some JavaScript behind it that allows me to automate some of the basic bookkeeping that takes place during combat. Speeds things up a little bit, keeps you honest, and helps you with the basic math that as you get older you suddenly forget. Anyway, I digress. In Roll20, I have a map, and on that map are two PCs. Tessa, a messenger who is carrying an important bit of information across the Reichland, and Vort, a dwarf envoy from the mountains to the south. Tessa has enlisted Vort to ensure her safe passage from the city of Bogenhaven, through the treacherous Axbite Pass, and finally on to Helmgard. The content of the message is so secret that not even I have any idea what's in there. But if you were to say subscribe right now and drop a little bit of a comment, you might be able to decide what's in there. So go ahead and do that, and then maybe we'll work that into part of our campaign on our Twitch stream. Anyway, the point is, as the two slog ever westward, they find themselves caught in this horrific winter storm. The wind howls and frigid air cuts through their furs and chills them to the bone. The snow and ice make travel impossible and leave them with no choice but to enter the scary cave. Tessa and Vort's entrance into the cave has not gone unnoticed. Maybe it was the shifting in the light at the mouth of the cave as their forms obstructed the daylight, or maybe it was some small pebbles sort of tumbling into the mouth as they stepped in. Either way, the greenskins have set up an ambush and are waiting to see what happens next. Now, the first thing that we're going to do in this encounter is actually check for surprise. This is done by using an opposed test. So the greenskins will check against their stealth to try to remain hidden until the last moment, and the PCs, who are somewhat alert as they enter the cave, will actually use their passive perception. Now, the cool thing with passive perception is the GM actually makes the roll, so the PCs are none the wiser if they don't detect anything. So in this check, Guch Bonereaver actually has a spot-on success, rolling a 40 out of 40. The Snotling in the back rolls an 18 out of 30, so a success with a success level of 2. Now remember, success level is used for all sorts of things. In an opposed test like this, you compare success levels to determine who actually wins. The second Snotling, the Snotling closest to Vort, actually has a fumbling failure, meaning he failed because he rolled a 55 out of 20, but he also rolled doubles. This means it's a special kind of failure, up to the GM really as to what happens there. Likewise, the dice are not kind to Vort, who also rolls a fumbling failure with a success level of -5. So technically his failure was worse than the Snotling's failure. So the Snotling might make some accidental noise, but Vort just doesn't notice. He's probably more interested in his mead horn or something like that. Tessa rolls a 93 out of 38, which is also a failure with a success level of -6. If there weren't fumbling failure involved, you would simply compare the success levels, and that would be that. The highest one always wins. But here, the Snotling actually had a fumbling failure while trying to remain quiet and hidden, so I'm going to assume that Tessa actually detects him. "Boy," she says, "there's something moving. Just there." He grimaces as he tries to see further into the darkness despite the daylight behind him.
"I'll go take a look, lassie. You wait here."
At this point, combat has officially begun and it's time to determine initiative order. Now, the fastest way to do this is actually go from the highest agility to the lowest agility. If you prefer a more random generation approach, then you can roll for initiative, in which case each character is going to make an initiative check and you compare success levels. That can take a long time though, particularly if you've got a map full of bad guys with a large party. So ultimately, you do you, but keep in mind that the game at this point is supposed to move as fast as possible. Since I had absolutely nothing but time, I did go ahead and randomly generate these initiatives, and then I loaded them all up into Roll20's turn order applet. This is pretty cool. Basically allows you to put any token in the map into the initiative order and then just kind of keep track of that step by step. Now, first up is Vort with an initiative of 16. Now, every combatant gets a move and an action. So first, Vort is actually going to use his move to approach the area that Tessa's pointing to, this weird shadow that seems to be shifting there at the edge of the cave. So he's going to move 7, which is well inside of his movement of 8. The way you calculate movement, of course, is for walking. It is basically twice your move attribute, and then again twice that for running, and so on. At any rate, as he gets closer, maybe the GM points out you do see a shadow, and you see floppy ears and this diminutive stature. It's clearly a greenskin. Vort, without a doubt, is going to attack. Now, keep in mind that if Vort had charged in, he could have earned himself some advantage, but he wasn't really sure the enemy was there until he was too close. For a charge, you actually have to be your move attribute away from your target. So as he approached and using his free action, Vort drew his short sword. When he realized what he was facing, he slashed out at it, but unfortunately he didn't succeed, rolling an 84 versus 48. That's a success level of -4. The Snotling, on the other hand, has this sharpened femur bone, and it's attempting to protect itself. So in this case, a success level of -1 compared to -4 is actually better. So the Snotling, believe it or not, parries Vort's blow. There's a couple things to think about. First, both parties are now engaged. In other words, they are in combat with one another. If they stop fighting each other for some reason, they've resolved their differences, then they can become unengaged. There's a couple other ways to get out of it, but keep in mind that both parties are considered to be engaged with one another because they're duking it out. Secondly, because the Snotling actually won the opposed test against Vort, it actually gains 1 advantage. And what this does is represents the ebb and flow of combat, right? Of one party having the upper hand against the next. So here we'll give that Snotling +1 advantage on the combat tracker, which you'll note is actually going to give them a +10 bonus when attacking Vort. So it raises its sharpened femur and attempts to plunge it into the dwarf's gut. Unfortunately, the dice gods aren't gonna have that, so the Snotling rolls a 45 out of 35, so basically a failure with a success level of -1. Vort, in his attempt to raise his sword and parry, also fails with a success level of -4. Now, this doesn't mean that the Snotling suddenly hits. The Snotling failed, plain and simple. There are some weird scenarios where one fumbles and the next one fumbles, but slightly less than the other one fumbles. Anyway, the point is, use your best judgment, keep the story moving forward, and you'll be just fine. Now, one important note here. The Snotling technically won in the opposed check against Vort with a -1 versus a -4. But since it failed to do damage in its attack against Vort, it will actually lose 1 advantage. Since it only had 1 advantage, it will now be back to a 0 modifier instead of a +10 bonus. So we will update that in our handy-dandy official-unofficial combat tracker, and the battle will rage on. Next up is Guch Bone Reaver. I mean, he prefers if you pronounce it Bone Rever, but Guk sees an opportunity. The target is not quite far enough away for a charge, but he can attack from behind since Vort is engaged with the Snotling. There are a couple things to think about here. First and foremost, his attack will go unopposed because Vort is engaged and unaware that he's even there. Secondly, Vort will now be outnumbered 2 to 1, which will mean that both assailants get a plus 20 bonus when attempting to attack him. Guk makes his attack roll and scores a 20 out of 45. This is a success level of 2, and since the roll was uncontested, we know it hit. The next step is to roll against the random hit location table and determine where that blow landed. Roll20 was kind enough to calculate this for me and came up with a head. That's probably not going to work out all that well. We then calculate damage as follows. So for melee, in most cases, the strength bonus is involved. That's what SB stands for. In Guk's case, that's actually a 2. So 2 for strength bonus, 3 for the weapon, and then based on the success level of the roll, the wound can get worse, which is really awesome. So in Guk's case, he inflicts 7 wounds against Vort. Damage reduction. This happens essentially in 2 ways. First is the toughness bonus, which in Vort's case is 4. So toughness always reduces the amount of physical damage you take. So that takes that 7 down to 3. Next, we think about armor. Now, Vort doesn't wear a helmet, unfortunately, despite everything his mother suggested. And so he's going to take 3 wounds. So we will go ahead then and record 3 wounds in the current section of our handy dandy official unofficial combat tracker. And just for my sanity purpose, I'll go ahead, or maybe it's not sanity, it's OCD, but I will still go ahead and wound him for 3 wounds over in Roll20. Next up, we have Tessa. Seeing the dwarf's plight against Guk and the Snotling, she realizes she needs to act quickly. She decides to use her movement as a charge. She's far enough away to do so, and there's a bit of a benefit if she does. So she'll close the distance between she and Guk, and she'll gain herself +1 advantage in the process. Now, the GM does rule that since she's charging in, she's not exactly being subtle, so Guk will be able to oppose the attack roll. So Tessa rolls a 38 out of 50, which is a success with a success level of 2. Guk attempts to oppose, but fails with a 35 out of 25, and that's a success level of -1. Next up, we randomly determine the site of the blow, which turns out to be the left leg. Now, GMs, do yourselves a favor. Try to stay with the visual, the narrative of the combat. So in this case, I'm going to assume that Guk threw a leg up, trying to do like some kind of roundhouse kick to block the blow, and that's where Tessa stabbed it. With that in mind, we will then determine damage, taking Tessa's strength bonus of 2, adding 2 for the weapon for a total of 4, and then 2 for the accuracy of her blow, making a total of 6. We will reduce that number by Guk's toughness bonus of 2 and determine his final wound of 4. We will again note this on our handy dandy combat tracker, as well as putting it in Roll20, mainly because of some sort of OCD issue that the GM may have at this moment, but we'll get through that. It's just fine. Hang with us, please. Just don't leave. That concludes Tessa's turn, and we now move on to the Snotling, who as of yet has been undiscovered. That Snotling sees what's going on and decides it is going to also attack the dwarf. This will resume the outnumbered 2 to 1 condition that the poor dwarf has going on and grant the Snotling and the other Snotling +20 in trying to chop his head off. Now, to keep track of what rolls will be opposed and what ones won't, I like to think about the character's point of view. So remember, Vort was facing the Snotling here to the east, and this one kind of came running in from to the north. I'm going to assume that Vort could see this in the periphery, and I'm going to let him go ahead and oppose the roll. So the way that worked out for us is the Snotling rolled a 15 versus 45, so a pretty solid success, a success level of +3. Vort also had a very solid attempt to go ahead and thwart the blow, but only had a success level of +2. So this does mean that the Snotling's blow lands. And so we will go ahead and calculate the random hit location, which in this case turns out to be the body. We will figure out damage, which in this case is 7. So strength bonus of 2, weapon of 2, and success level of 3. We will reduce that damage by 2 factors this time. First, Vort's toughness of 4, which reduces the damage down to 3. And then the fact that Vort is wearing a leather jack gives him an armor bonus for his body of 1. So we'll reduce that down to 2. While the player and very likely the dwarf both scoff at the infinitesimal damage, the GM will go ahead and update the combat tracker as well as Roll20. This concludes the Snotling's turn. The dwarf bellows with rage and attacks the Snotling that he's already engaged with. He rolls a 16 versus 48, which is a success with a success level of 3. The Snotling tries to oppose and is successful, but only has a success level of 0. So the dwarf wins, resulting in a total of 5 wounds to the Snotling's body. Its toughness of 2 will reduce that to 3. We will go ahead and record that in our combat tracker so that we have that for later, and the round will move on. Next, the green skin with its back to the wall lashes out against the dwarf. Now, with all bonuses considered, it rolls a 44 out of 45. Not that impressive of a success, but since it was doubles, it is a critical success. This means a lot for poor Vort, who only rolls a 65 out of 48. In other words, he fails to defend himself with a success level of -2. Since there was a critical success involved, we have to issue a critical wound to Vort. This is done by making a random roll for the body site that was affected by the attack. So I've used Roll20's built-in table for this. I came up with a 33. That's a torn muscle. So the blow slams into his forearm, gaining a bleeding condition and a torn muscle, which is a minor injury. He takes 2 wounds. We note all of that in our combat tracker, but keep in mind now that if Vort is right-handed, he's going to have a hard time in combat, so the player should be role-playing that as much as possible. Next up, we have Guch Bone Reaver, who is going to turn and attack Tessa. He rolls a 13 out of 25, which is a decent success, a success level of +1. Tessa tries to defend herself, but has a fumbling failure. This means a couple of things. First, she's going to get hit. Secondly, she has to make a roll on the oops table to determine what happens as a result of her fumble. Guch deals 6 points of damage, which is reduced by 3 because of Tessa's toughness. So she'll take 3 points of damage, and then she'll make her roll on the oops table. With a roll of 45, her maneuver is misjudged. Had she a ranged weapon, she would actually drop it, but instead she's actually going to take a penalty to her action next round. That's -10. So keep in mind that because this was an opposed roll, the attacker, in this case Guch, will actually get +1 advantage, and Tessa will lose all advantage. So this isn't going to work out well for her next round either. Tessa rolls an 83 out of 30, a pretty miserable failure with a success level of -5. Guch, in turn, attempts to parry, failing also with a 39 of 35, or a -0 success level. So blade is meeting blade, chips are flying off of the bent, rusted thing that Guch has, but the battle carries on. Next up, the Snotling stabs out with its sharpened femur, rolling a 57 against 45, so success level -1. Failure, and Vort succeeds with a 26 out of 48 in defending himself. So no harm, no foul. Combat continues. Vort has had enough. He slashes out with his short sword again, rolling a 39 out of 58. This is a success level of 2. The Snotling attempts to parry, but only scores a success level of 1 with a 12 out of 25. So Vort is actually successful in clipping the creature's right leg. Calculating damage, we come up with 9, so 3 for Vort's strength bonus, 4 for the weapon, and 2 for the success level. The Snotling actually has a toughness of 2, so reducing that by 2. 7, though, is still enough to take the Snotling to -1. Now, in certain circumstances, you would want to roll a critical roll instead, but I prefer to use the death blow rules. And what that says is basically your minor mobs, so your Snotlings or your lesser creatures, when they hit 0, let them die. Save the critical rolls and all that kind of narrative for more meaningful enemies. if nothing else, you're going to eventually run out of types of wounds to describe, and the dramatic impact of those wounds is going to be lessened. So, rule of thumb, if it's a minor mob, when they hit 0, let them die. Back to Guch and Tessa. Guch actually attempts to chop Tessa's head off with this bent hand axe of his, and is unsuccessful with a 95 out of 35. Tessa also fails miserably with a 75 out of 40. At the end of the day, they're just clashing blades, maneuvering around. There's all kinds of grunting and noise and that kind of stuff. With advantage shifting as it is, Tessa actually rolls a 21 out of 40, a success with a success level of 2. The hit location is the left arm. Guch attempts to parry the blow but fails with a 75 out of 25. So next up, you know what to do. Let's calculate damage. So we have 2 for her strength bonus, 2 for her dagger, and 2 for her success level. So a total of 6, reduced by 2 for Guch's toughness. That yields 4 wounds. Now, this puts Guch in an interesting situation because it brings him to 0. Anytime a major bad person, right, so not just your mobs, but a major bad guy or a PC reaches 0, they instantly gain the prone condition. This essentially means that Guch has been knocked down. On his next round, he can't crawl, he can't run, he can't do anything but use his move to stand up, and any action he takes, if he tries to slash at Tessa's ankles or anything like that, he's actually going to be at -20. So I've actually updated the combat tracker for that, as well as Tessa's increased advantage, which is going to play out in her next turn. The remaining Snotling now takes its turn. It rolls a 21 out of 25, which is a success with a success level of 0, but since it's an opposed check, Vort actually scores better with a 23 out of 48 for a success level of 2. So he clashes his short sword against the sharpened femur, and battle carries on. Vort now returns the blow, rolling a 46 versus 58 for a success level of 1. The Snotling fails to defend itself and therefore will take some damage to the body. Now the damage overall is 8, reduced by the toughness from the Snotling, which is 2, still leaves us with 6 wounds. That means it takes the Snotling to 0, and since it's a basic mob, the death blow rule applies. The Snotling, he dead. Maddened by pain, bleeding badly, Guch swipes at Tessa's ankles, and because of the heavy penalties is actually not able to hit. He rolls a 62 versus a target number of 5. Tessa, in turn, rolls a 24 versus 60 for her parry, so she's able to defend herself without any problem. Also, keep in mind, because she won the opposed test, she's going to gain more advantage. As the little green skin leader tries to get to his feet, Tessa lashes out with her dagger again, rolling a 42 versus the new target number of 70. This is an impressive success for a success level of 3. Guch tries to defend himself but is unsuccessful, so he's going to take some damage to his left arm. Now keep in mind that since Guch has already been reduced to 0 wounds, any amount of damage is going to result in a critical wound. So we will go ahead and make a random check against the left arm table to see exactly what Tessa does to poor Guch. With a roll of 84, Guch's finger is severed. He gapes in horror as it flies across the cave, resulting in an amputation. He gains a bleeding condition, and he's going to take 4 wounds. As you can see, things are not working out very well for poor Guch. He is outnumbered now, 2 to 1. He's prone, which is a big deal. He's missing a finger, and he has no wounds left. So, I'll spare us the further die rolling, and let's just get to the end game here. And so, slipping and sliding in the pools of black blood forming around their felled adversaries, Tessa and Vort take a moment to thank Sigmar that they're alive. Will they stay the night in the cave? Will they venture out into the cold? Who really knows? But we have successfully demonstrated the general idea behind Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th Edition combat and some tips and tactics to help you manage it all. I hope you guys enjoyed. Let's get out of the computer. That's it. Job done. We have completed the combat system in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th Edition. I hope you guys have gotten a lot out of this series. I've had a hell of a lot of fun making it. Up next, we're going to take a look at items and weapons, qualities, that sort of thing, and dive a little bit as well into magic and see how the
sort of stuff works. If you're having as much fun as we are, do us a favor and click the subscribe button below. Slowly but surely, we are mastering the YouTube algorithm. Also, click the bell because I hear a rumor that it will give you insight as to what we're doing next. Seriously though, thank you all for your support. Thanks for tuning into the channel. We're gonna call this one done.